So we are in the first week of Liz Truss's premiership. She is actually speaking in the Commons as we record, announcing her new policy to help people with their energy bills. We think we know a bit about that plan already, but we will unpick it in greater detail next episode. But I want to get both of your reflections actually on what her first week has been like so far. What did you make of her cabinet appointments, for example?
I think they were all as briefed, so there's no big surprise in there. I think it's kind of been said by a lot of people that there are pretty much no supporters of Rishi Sunak, even though I think her press secretary put out a statement pretty much like straight afterwards saying this is a unity cabinet and it contains 5 members of the leadership contest, and that kind of underlined that certainly did not include Rishi Sunak. It seems that he probably wouldn't have taken a job any case, but yeah, that will spell trouble for her at a later stage. I think it was notable at PMQs that while she seemed to have a lot of support, none of her critics were there. You know, I think she's got a free rein, she's got a free run to have her first few weeks.
I think, as has been already said, but quite rightly, there are more big, talented names on the back benches than you would expect at this stage, and that destabilises things for the entire Conservative Party. They are not going to jump into rebellion at this stage. They're going to give her a honeymoon, but they are a source of, I think they constrain her. In terms of the policies that she wants to move on to, there are big groups of potential rebels on almost every side. But in terms of the cabinet itself, I take a slightly different view from a lot of people. I think this is a strong-ish cabinet, and it's certainly stronger than Boris Johnson's cabinet. I think you think of Appointing, and you think of Cleverly, you think of Coffey, and you think, of course, of Ben Wallace as well, still in as Defence Secretary. That is a very, very strong quartet, really at the heart of the cabinet. A former senior cabinet member, I better not say who it was, who's out now, said she has got the most ideologically united cabinet that I can remember, and that is a strength. But the price for that is she has got the most divided parliamentary party, and that isn't.
I think it's worth saying that the two of the leadership contenders that were quite a threat to her, you've got Kemi Badenoch, who's been sent out to be Trade Secretary. That kind of keeps her away from Westminster, keeps her kind of out of the picture for a while, because she might be tied up chasing a US-UK trade deal that's not likely to happen and that Joe Biden's not going to be interested in, so it might not offer Kemi the opportunity to kind of build her profile in the same way. And similarly with Penny Mordaunt, she's been given leader of the House of Commons, so that's not a brief in and of itself. She doesn't have a portfolio, she doesn't have policy that she can play with. She's in a kind of sidelined role, even though she's at the cabinet table.
It's interesting that those two have been put in those roles, isn't it? Because those are the two names, when I was speaking to Tory members over the summer, that they all wished were on the ballot paper. They were the most popular among the membership. And does it suggest a slight lack of confidence in Liz Truss that she won't give those kind of popular people higher positions?
I think the short answer to that, Anoosh, is yes. But also Tom Tugendhat, you see him grinning slightly uneasily at the end of the cabinet table in those photographs. He's got a sort of very specific security brief. The things where he agrees with Liz Truss, China, some of the security issues, there's no threat to her there because they completely agree, but it's a very limited brief.
Yes, of course. And talking about that ideological sort of consensus at the top of government now, it's interesting, isn't it? Because these people are known as free marketeers. Kwarteng and Truss worked on the Britannia Unchained book together in 2012, which was all about free enterprise, deregulation, making a smaller state. But actually, it seems that her first act as Prime Minister, her first big act will be to fix energy prices specifically, which is completely against sort of probably all of her political instincts. And it reminds me a bit of how Rishi Sunak when he became Chancellor. The first thing he had to do was announce the furlough scheme and all of this unprecedented spending for the state, which was also against his own instincts.
Force majeure, because of, really since the pandemic and then through into the war, this is an era when we are relearning the importance of the big state. And if you look at the polling, actually the British public wants more state security, more state support than we've wanted for a very, very long time. So the overarching irony, I think, of this whole conversation and of the political period that we're in is that we have an instinctively small state government, a very small state government, at a time when the country wants a big state. And that is going to be a tension that really defines Liz Truss's premiership, I think.
But I can't help but thinking that kicks the can down the road a little bit, and I can understand why Keir Starmer might start out saying Liz Truss is looking at a magic money tree, because I think the public hasn't been presented with any of the potential compromises yet. When we are faced with just how big the COVID backlogs are going to be, and we look at kind of what kind of service the NHS is going to be able to provide. And we've also spent a lot of money on bailing out energy companies rather than perhaps opting for a windfall tax, going for a different kind of option. I wonder if that might be the point when the public start to wonder about the wisdom of spending a great deal all of the time, even though they've become very used to it because of the COVID pandemic.
It would be more interesting if we were going to disagree all the way through this, but I completely agree with that. I have to say, I think there's in the immediate short term, I think this big announcement today of support for energy bills will give Liz Truss a lot of uplift. I think there'll be a general sense of, shoulders down, exhaling relief across the country, because everyone's been so terrified of these bills in small businesses and in households. Now, Keir Starmer thinks that he has set a big trap for her. If she rules out the windfall taxes on these huge profits the energy utilities are making, then she has to raise the money through borrowing, basically, or by some kind of scheme, which means that we're all going to be paying higher energy bills. Now, borrowing, I think it's very interesting. There are Tory MPs and indeed Labour MPs I've bumped into the last few days who say, I'm watching the last gilt auction very carefully. I'm really interested in bond yields. We haven't heard this in British politics for a long time. But what they're really asking is, will the international markets buy this huge amount of borrowing? Do they have confidence in Liz Truss's government, looking after the shop? And if the answer to that is no, and the pound goes down, and as it seems, the Bank of England jack interest rates up further than they were going to, then we're all going to be paying for this through higher interest rates, higher inflation, higher borrowing. Anyone with a mortgage is really going to notice it. But it takes some time for that to filter through. People are just relieved not to be paying those energy bills at the moment. And the other side of the cost will take some time to filter through. One other thing I would say is that I think if you choose not to tax eye-wateringly huge profits being made, nothing to do with the brilliance of their business model, but just because of the international gas price by the energy companies, then every single time the opposition or lobby groups ask for more money to improve sewerage or sort the court system out or get more police on the beat or sort the ambulance system out or help with school infrastructure or whatever it is, and the Truss government says, no, we can't afford that, the entire country will point their finger and say, what about those profits? You forewent all of that. And I think that will be a big political problem for them.
It's interesting that I can't understand why Liz Truss is not putting more energy into kind of selling her policy then for that reason, kind of describing it as saying, well, we don't want to deter investment. It doesn't explain it as fully as people will need in a couple of years' time if they are kind of faced with those kind of compromises. And similarly, I don't think Labour's done enough to kind of describe how the windfall, the tax that they want, is not what Labour might ordinarily call for in terms of an increase in public spending on, say, the NHS, which would be paid for through increased general taxation. And I think when you kind of hear someone like Simon Clarke this morning, the new Levelling Up Secretary, saying, Labour always calls for more tax, more tax, that's a brand problem for Labour because it's always been kind of pro more public spending. So I don't know if Labour's described its policy as well as it needs to.
Yes, I think if I was Keir Starmer, I would be sort of probably boasting more that the government was stealing another policy of his rather than trying to draw that dividing line quite so often, because the word tax, doesn't it? It verifies something that many voters still assume about the Labour Party, which is that it's the party of high tax. So I think that is vulnerability. It was one of Liz Truss's better comebacks at PMQs, wasn't it? There's nothing new about a Labour leader who wants to put up taxes, and that was actually clipped on the BBC News that evening as well. So a lot of people will have seen that, and there is that stubborn assumption still about what Labour's economic outlook is.
So in terms of rhetoric and, as it were, painting the picture, what Labour has to do is distinguish very, very clearly between windfall corporate taxes in extraordinary times and normal taxes, because people don't like high taxes, and that has worked for the Tories because they don't like high taxes on them and their incomes. High taxes for the fat cats, high taxes for the utility companies, that is something entirely different.
No, absolutely. And so, just lastly, what did you make of her first PMQs and Keir Starmer's response to her as well? It was very different, wasn't it, in tone from how he used to face Boris Johnson across the dispatch box?
I thought she did surprisingly well. I think a lot of Labour figures were kind of quite not shocked, but I think they said, we should never underestimate Liz Truss. That was kind of briefed out as a line, but I think even in addition to that, they were surprised at just how competently, crisply, confidently she kind of dealt with her first PMQs. She didn't seem at all overwhelmed, seemed kind of steady, answered a lot of questions very directly. I think they were kind of gearing up for Liz Truss to be a bit more evasive and to sort of try and bat away questions, but when asked a yes or no question, she came back with a yes or no.
I have to tell you that I first went in as a young reporter into the House of Commons in the mid-1980s, and I hung over the press gallery and watched Margaret Thatcher in her pomp at her best, fighting with Neil Kinnock. And I was reminded a bit of that, in a good way, in the sense we've had lots of sort of silly jokes and Bertie Woosterish nonsense in PMQs and a lot of personal attacks during the Boris Johnson era. And now we are back to a much crisper, your word again, Rach, much crisper debate on the big politics. And big politics is back. This was an ideological clash between a Conservative leader who's not very big on humour, but is utterly self-confident. I thought that the way Liz Truss stood at the dispatch box, she was pivoting, staring around the chamber with a smile on her face, enjoying every minute of it. She didn't talk about the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Defence Secretary. She said, my Chancellor of the Exchequer, my Defence Secretary, my Health Secretary. She was absolutely in command. And she gave very straight answers. So Keir Starmer, I think, had probably, with Boris Johnson, you'd have had to ask 6 or 7 times whether or not he was in favour of a windfall tax, and she came straight back with it. And you could see the slight look of surprise in Keir Starmer's eyes. I mean, I think I know he welcomes this. He thinks proper, serious, grown-up politics is what the country wants to hear. And we don't very often bring you good news on these podcasts, but I think that the return of proper politics is good news. And I think she is partly responsible for that.
Yeah, I think sort of Labour's team was saying they were hoping for PMQs that was a bit more illuminating, and they felt that they got that.
We certainly got that.
But I do think Liz Truss kind of coming out and saying, well, I'm, again, the third female Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister. Labour's never had that line will come out every single week.
Yeah, and you saw Rachel Reeves and Angela Rayner on either side of Keir Starmer looking just a little sick at that line. They couldn't nod, they couldn't put a thumbs up, but you could see what they were thinking.
Yeah, that's something that Starmer's going to need to figure out how to deal with, and he's going to have to find a response that's meaningful.
Response to that. I think the response so far has been, well, it helps if you change leader every 2 years, which I don't think quite cuts it, does it?
I think the obvious diversity argument, because of course Labour have a diversity argument in terms of community background as well. They have very few black and Asian faces compared to the Tories at the top level. But I think what they have to keep hammering is, as it were, social diversity. The fact that almost every member of the cabinet, something 20 odd, are privately school educated. And whatever colour the skin, they've all been to top public schools. They've all come from very, very wealthy and successful families. And Labour have to keep asking the question, are they really able to understand everybody's day-to-day experience?
Yes, because I think there was some Sutton Trust research, wasn't there, that said that it was the most privately educated cabinet, more so than Theresa May's, Boris Johnson's and David Cameron's as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just bizarre to hear the government attack the Labour Party over not being woke enough. Which just makes me giggle, really. Yeah.
Politics goes topsy-turvy again. Sorry to interrupt the discussion, but we've just had the news that the household support, so the freeze of energy bills, will be for 2 years, and the freeze for businesses will be for 6 months. So what does that timing tell you?
I think we all know the answer to that.
We need our finest minds on this one.
Well, it confirms that the Prime Minister Liz Truss plans to borrow her way to the next general election. It'll be interesting what the compromise is going to be with businesses in 6 months, because they've not been protected by the cap before now either, so they've already been kind of struggling. So,
and also, I'd be very interested to find out what eventually the definition of business is, because of course, hospitals, libraries, care homes, a huge range of places, churches, where people spend a lot of time, are not normally defined as businesses in that sense, and will be in desperate need of support too. So the minute you start supporting people in this kind of crisis, the support just keeps spreading. And I wonder also whether, if it's for 2 years, how much the next general election campaign is going to be dominated by the details of whether or not that support is withdrawn or whether it goes ahead. Or, of course, you don't know what the energy prices will be by then. With any luck, there'll be a lot. So in a sense, I suppose, Rachel and Anoosh, she is hoping, gambling, that the war is over by then, that the situation in Ukraine is finally resolved before the election.
And just how she's going to justify the borrowing if it means compromises for public services. I think that's where Labour's magic money tree attack may come in before the next election. We shall see.